What's going on, guys? It's Alex here. So gonna be starting a new knife build today, and this is gonna be a tough one. It's actually gonna be probably the hardest knife that I've ever built so far because it's a giant knife. So let me jump in here real quick. I ended up running into some problems with this blade post heat treatment, and the knife didn't turn out how I intended it to, and I almost threw out the blade completely. But I'll get to those problems later and how I tried to fix them, and also what to look out for if you run into the same problems. But for now, we'll just continue on as if nothing ever happened. I don't know if this design is even going to fit on my steel, so may end up having to modify it a little. So I actually did end up having to modify the design. I was originally going to make the blade a little bit longer, but realized it wouldn't fit in my quench tank, so I had to leave the blade length as it was. I was also going to leave the pommel area exposed and kind of have the tang kind of exposed at the end and have the scales stop short. For the life of me, I can't think of what that's called off the top of my head, but I ended up having to kind of scrap that idea because I realized I wouldn't be able to get a real good purchase on the knife without bringing the scales all the way down to the end of the tang. Now, if I had a slightly wider piece of steel, I would be able to kind of continue on with that design. But for now, the scales will just have to come all the way down to the end of the knife. So grinding out steel is grinding out steel. There's really not much that can be said about it other than use a new disc. The worn out discs don't cut as well as the new ones do for some reason. I'm not real sure why, to be honest. And if you're using 1/4 inch, set aside a good block of your day to cut out a knife of this size, because it took me the better part of, I want to say, an hour to cut out this knife design. 1/4 inch steel takes quite a long time to grind through. It's funny because going from 1/4 inch back to 1/8 inch or pretty much anything thinner than 1/4 inch seems like you're cutting through cardboard at that point. It just goes so much faster when you're grinding through thin material. So a tool I don't really see that much in knife making is the regular old bench grinder with these stone discs. And I'm not real sure why they're not used more in knife making. The stone disc that I'm using removes metal really well. They last a long time too. They really help kind of cut down on belt use and belt wear. I can refine my rough design on the bench grinder and then take it to the belt sander for further refinement. Speaking of belt sanders, I ended up getting a new 4x36 the other day. Someone ended up giving it to me for free. So I think if you know where to look, you can find a lot of these tools for really cheap or for practically free. So keep your eyes open. You never know where some of this stuff might pop up. Now, someone asked me the other day about the belts that I was using. I would 100% recommend buying ceramic belts. The ceramic belts are way better than the crappy Diablo belts that you'll buy from stores like Home Depot and your local hardware stores. These are made for cutting metal. They last a lot longer, they don't clog up, and they just work all around a lot better. And price-wise, they're really not that much more expensive. In a lot of cases, they are practically the same price, especially if you're used to kind of buying the name brands like Diablo and some of the other, I don't know what the Lowe's brand is, but if you end up buying the name brand belts, you're not going to really pay that much more for ceramic belts. And they'll last way longer and they'll work a lot better for you. Now, speaking of Home Depot, man, talk about segues here. We're killing it. But anyway, speaking of Home Depot, I ended up getting this little magnet from there the other day, and it does a really good job of holding my knife blade flat against the sander platen for surface grinding. Now, I checked the platen on this sander, and it's actually really flat, like amazingly flat. So surface grinding on this is actually working out really well. You can really kind of see the results once I'm done here. It looks really nice. Everything's nice and flat. Although I think if I ended up making a knife a little bit bigger, I would have had trouble getting it on this sander here. So the belt I'm using here is an 80 grit ceramic, and honestly, I don't really think that you need to go a whole lot coarser than 80 grit. 80 grit will remove metal incredibly fast, and it really does a good job no matter what you're doing. Now, I do have a 36 grit ceramic belt that I've used to help kind of clean up my rough edges and rough design, and it works really well, but one of the problems with the coarser grit belts is that they don't work too terribly great with slower belt speeds, and they seem like they wear out faster. Another thing is they leave really deep scratches in the steel itself, especially if you're doing kind of like I'm doing now and using your belt sander to surface grind, some of those scratches can really be in there deep, and you end up having to remove a whole lot of metal in order to get those deep scratches out. So you just have to be careful with coarser belts. So from the 80 grit ceramic, I then went to the 120 grit ceramic belt, and then I ended up going to my surface conditioning belt. I have a coarse, a medium, and a fine. And honestly, I can't remember what I did here. I think the finish on this now is the coarse finish. And I think that's kind of what I leave it at till I end up heat treating the blade. So I'm just using a paint marker here to try and mark out the exact center of the blade, or a grind line in which to grind my bevels to. Now a paint marker or a Sharpie, it really doesn't work that well. It's really probably a good idea to end up getting some layout fluid. I hear it works a lot better, but the idea is to kind of mark your bevel into the paint using a drill bit or a set of calipers, and then grind to that line. Honestly, I had trouble seeing the line that I made from the calipers, so I ended up having to just kind of guess and go back and forth between my calipers and my eye as I was grinding in order to center the grind line in the center of the blade. So in order to grind this bevel, I've actually made a bevel jig and kind of rigged my 4x36 to specifically grind bevels. Now I'm not going to go over every modification that I've made to this thing because I could make an entire video on just the modifications I've made to my belt sander. But basically I've set it up to grind bevels with a bevel jig. Now I've tried freehand grinding on this particular setup, and because of the way I have the platen sitting on here and the fact that the whole entire sander vibrates like crazy, it makes freehand grinding really difficult. I can't imagine having a stationary sander that doesn't vibrate and just kind of sits there and the belt stays in one place. It must be a really nice thing to have, but for now I'm kind of working with this 4x36. Now with a bevel jig, it actually doesn't work too bad. It the bevel jig kind of locks everything in place, and for whatever reason, it kind of takes the vibration out of the whole setup. I don't know what it is, but it really doesn't work too terribly bad in this scenario. And you can see by the grind lines, it does a fairly good job. And again, the belt I'm using is just an 80 grit ceramic before moving to 120 grit ceramic. And then finally I moved to I think a medium surface conditioning belt before the heat treat. And I also took it back to the flat belt sander and hit all the flats with the same surface conditioning belt. So now I'm just using some calipers to lay out the pinholes and the lanyard hole. And then over the drill press to drill everything, I'm doing 3 pins and a lanyard tube on this knife. And I'm also drilling a bunch of smaller holes for the epoxy to flow through. And then on to countersinking all the holes with a countersink bit, and I just do this with a hand drill. Now I'm just using stainless steel hardware for this knife, and I'm just marking it to length and using an angle grinder to cut it to size. And then I'll take it over to the belt sander to deburr the ends, and I also use the belt sander and a drill to rough up the surface. I'm using a 60 grit belt here. Really, the coarser the belt, the better. Although if you're using the drill and a sander to kind of rough up the pins in this method, you need to be careful to not take the pin diameter down too much. Then I just filed in a Spanish notch, or otherwise known as a sharpening choil, and I just did that with a chainsaw file. Chainsaw files are great for this because they come in a bunch of different sizes and they really do a nice job. Alright, so it's time to heat treat the blade. Now, I had to make a bunch of modifications to my forge in order to be able to fit a blade of this size in there and to kind of heat the entire thing evenly. I used 2 torches in the forge, and I got a nice even heat on the blade, but one of the problems, and I mentioned this in the beginning, was the fact that my quench tank isn't big enough. Now, after quenching the blade, I ended up getting a rather significant warp in the blade. Now the warp on the knife ended up being exactly where the oil line was in my quench tank. So honestly, I think that may have played an issue in why I got a warp in the first place. So I think in the future, if I'm going to be heat treating a blade of this size, I'm going to try and make a bigger quench tank, something that I can fully submerge the blade and a good portion of the handle into. That way I don't get that huge temperature change or from one extreme to another right in the middle of the knife, right where the handle meets the blade. I feel like that's the reason that the blade warped the way it did. I'm sure it could have been from me not heating the blade evenly or a bunch of other factors, but exactly where the warp is exactly where the oil line was when I went to quench. Now I tried to straighten the warp in my bench vise and I did end up getting some of the warp out of the blade, but I didn't get enough of it out. Now I didn't end up noticing the warp in the blade until after the entire heat treatment process was over, and this is my mistake. I should have double checked with a straight edge and made sure that as much of the warp was removed as possible before I ended up tempering the blade, before I ended up spending any more time on it. But I didn't, and I only noticed it when I brought it back and put it on the belt sander and tried to grind off the scale from the heat treatment process. I noticed that the belt wasn't coming in contact fully with the blade and it was only hitting the tang of the knife and the very tip of the knife. Now I actually tried to flatten the warp out, but the problem with that is because my bevels were already ground, the more I ended up grinding on the blade, the smaller my bevel got at the tip of the knife. Now this is a problem because you can't go back and just regrind your bevel without shortening the blade. And I only have so much blade length to play with, so I really didn't want to shorten the blade shorter than it already was, or honestly it would look kind of weird. It would look kind of silly. You ended up having this big handle and this relatively short blade. So the idea of just making a smaller knife, yeah, I guess that's a possibility. I guess you can definitely do that. I guess I could possibly do that, but in all honesty, I wouldn't be happy with it. It would be kind of a weird looking knife and it would kind of be useless. I mean, you have this giant handle and this rather short blade, and it would just kind of look silly. So after a lot of thought, I decided to go ahead and push on and finish the knife, even though the bevels are going to be ground kind of weird. One of them's larger than the other, and the bevel's kind of off center a little bit. And honestly though, you wouldn't really notice it unless you really knew what you were looking for. Most people probably wouldn't notice it, but I notice it, and I think a lot of other knife guys would definitely notice it. Now, I actually ordered scale material specifically for this knife, and the scale material is relatively expensive. G10 is what I was planning on using, and both of those scales end up costing like $20 or something like that. And I didn't want to put a set of $20 scales on a knife that isn't even worth $20. So I decided to experiment with some hickory I had lying around. I have a bunch of hickory lying around for some axe projects that I constantly have ongoing. And I have a bunch of knife scale size pieces. Now this isn't stabilized hickory or anything like that. This is just plain old regular hickory without any stabilization. It's just straight from the tree. Now, I've been wanting to experiment with natural wood a little bit more. One of the reasons that I haven't used it more is because I'm kind of afraid that gluing natural wood to steel, basically wood is a living substance. It needs to expand and contract, and when you take a piece of wood, something that needs to expand and contract, and kind of permanently mount it to a piece of steel, something that doesn't expand and contract, a lot of times you end up running into problems. Although I have seen 100-plus-year-old knives with a lot of use with their original natural wood scale material still solidly mounted in place. So it's definitely possible to get a natural wood material to somehow bond or mate with the steel of a knife relatively permanently and never have problems with it. I really like the way natural wood feels. It definitely has a better feel, I think, than synthetic handle material. There's almost nothing like the feel of a nice worn-in axe handle after it's had a lot of use, after it's been conditioned perfectly, and I'd really like to kind of emulate that on a knife handle. So since I've already kind of screwed up this knife in a pretty good way, I figure I might as well use it as an experimentation knife and just throw a set of natural wood scales on here and see how they hold up. So epoxying pretty much is what it is. You basically just make sure everything's clean and dust free. Mix the epoxy, mix it really well, smear it all over everything and stick everything together, clamp it and wipe up the excess. There's not a whole lot to go over as far as that's concerned, but one thing that I would mention is I'd highly recommend reading the manufacturer's technical specifications on whatever epoxy you choose to use. There's a lot of helpful information in there as far as surface prep and kind of the best way to get the most out of the epoxy, so it's definitely worth a read. So 24 hours later and our knife pretty much looks like crap, but this kind of leads to, I think, what's most people's favorite part is the shaping of the handle. Now there's not too many technical specs that I can go over or tips or tricks that I can give you other than use pretty much whatever means necessary to shape your handle. You do have to be careful when you're doing this to not burn the wood as you're shaping the handle, especially if you're using relatively large pins like I'm using. I'm using 1/4 inch pins, stainless steel pins, so you have to be really careful to not get those too hot while you're sanding, because they'll easily burn the epoxy and you'll compromise the bond and it'll also look like crap. But I'm pretty much just using all the contours and shapes of both of my sanders in order to shape the handle, and then I just go on to hand sanding. The nice thing about wood is that it does sand very easily, but that also comes with a downside because even with hand sanding you have to be careful to not take too much in certain areas. Once I have the handle pretty much to where I want it, I'll take it back to the sander and even out the spine all the way down the entire length of the knife, and I'll just do that. This is a 220 grit belt, and then I'll move over to a blue surface conditioning belt, and that leaves a really nice finish. Next thing I'll do is what's called raise the grain. I'll just take a lightly damp rag and wipe it all over the surface of the wood, and that'll make the wood grains actually stand on end. Then you can go ahead and resand with your final grit on your sandpaper. What that'll do is it'll raise the grain of the wood, and then you can sand it smooth. Now if you skip that step and go right to applying your final finish, you'll notice that what was once a really smooth, nice handle turned into a rough handle after you apply your final finish. And that's because the grain raises when you go ahead and apply that finish. Now if you do it beforehand with water and then sand it smooth, typically the wood won't raise its grain again and you'll get a much nicer final finish. The finish I'm using is just teak oil. I really don't have any experience using this finish on knife handles. Typically I'll use boiled linseed oil on stuff like axe handles and things like that, but this is completely new to me, so I really have no input on it yet. So at this point, I'm going to call this knife finished. It's really a shame that the knife turned out the way it did. It could have been a really nice knife if it wasn't for the bow going down the middle of the knife and the fact that the bevels are different widths on each side towards the tip of the knife. But I guess it kind of is what it is. So let's see what we can do with this thing, and at least it's a workable tool, or let's find out if it's a workable tool. Just want to thank you guys for watching. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe if you're not already, and also hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks guys.